Hi, welcome to CCTV Channel 17, live at 525, the Preservation Burlington Show. Preservation Burlington is a nonprofit 501c3 organization whose mission is to preserve and protect the historic architecture and livability of Burlington through education and advocacy. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in this month. We're very lucky to have a friend of Preservation Burlington and a founding member.
Yes, we're back.
Tom Visser back with us. I'm going to stop for a second, and you can talk about some of the upcoming stuff.
Sure.
But I do want to say that even though I wasn't part of the last show, that I was there for the talk at the sold-out talk at Champlain College. That was the biggest crowd I've ever seen at any one of the things there. So this really strikes a chord with the people in Burlington, I think, this topic of these grand estates and the stuff that's gone or partially still, there's some foundations at Oak Ledge. Yeah, it's just so neat and people really love it. So I'm really excited you came back, Tom.
Right.
And looking forward to this being a somewhat regular thing for a while anyway, because there's so much information, right? And
Sure.
Yeah, and you're doing a great job. News, business, the business end of things.
So in March, we are planning a Dear Diary event. That it's final date has yet to be decided, but we are going to focus on the suffrage movement since it's a big anniversary. So that's coming up in April. On April 19th, we are going to do our annual awards.
Yep.
So anybody has any nominations or ideas, including you, if you know of any great preservation projects in Burlington in the last year or two, we would love to hear about them. In May, we're starting a new Pine Street walking tour, or doing some Pine Street walking tours, right? Yep. And in June, we've got our annual homes tour, so June 6th.
Right.
So we've got a busy calendar coming up.
There's going to be, we're squeezing in a lot of place-specific walking tours. There's the Ramble one, so we're tweaking some of these, but we're going to have an event almost every month all the way through the fall, so it's going to be pretty
Bring
jam-packed.
on spring.
Yeah, I know. I know. Felt like it today a little bit, Those 17-degree days and then 37 feels like I want to go swimming,
Yeah. Yep.
So, Tom, thanks again for being here.
Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Liisa.
You're welcome. We're so glad to have you.
It's great to be back. And before we start, once again, I'd like to acknowledge the interest and support that Champlain College Special Collections has given to help with this research, as well as the University of Vermont Special Collections. Both of these archives that we have here in Burlington are amazing resources for doing this type of research.
It's a great place to be a historian.
We rely so heavily on special collections in particular that it's a great thing.
And a good number of the images that I'll be sharing with everyone today have come from those sources, as well as online and from postcard collections and so on. But our theme today, our exploration, will be looking at the history of Overlake.
Okay, we can go to
that. Overlake is one of the grand estates that was located in the hill section of Burlington, basically south of the corner of Cliff Street and South Prospect Street, kind of just west of the UVM Redstone campus. This property was acquired in 1856 by LeGrand B. Cannon. Cannon was born in New York City in 1815, and after graduating from Rensselaer Institute in Troy, New York, he served in the U.S. Army in northern Vermont during the Canadian Rebellion of 1838. Cannon then made a substantial fortune in the 1840s in the wholesale dry goods trade, working out of Troy, New York, at a time, of course, with the canal era was so critical in our nation's history. And by 1850, he was so wealthy that he could move to New York City and basically lead a life of leisure. And it was in 1856 then that, while visiting Burlington with his brother-in-law, George DeForest, LeGrand Cannon bought a 60-acre parcel on the hill section in Burlington that provided magnificent views across the lake and towards the Adirondacks. And then, so he set about establishing this as his summer residence with his winter home in New York City. Cannon was described as, quote, stocky, possessive, and strongly opinionated.
Sounds like somebody else I know.
And he served in the U.S. Army during the Civil War, rising to the rank of colonel. He was also very well connected politically and was very highly respected. In 1864, he became the president of the Champlain Transportation Company. He also served as the vice president of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad.
Oh.
He was president of the Crown Point Iron Works Company. He was a trustee of the University of Vermont. He also owned the Vermont Stock Farm in Shelburne, Vermont, that specialized in breeding prize horses and dairy stock. And in 1895, he even purchased the Elba, New York farm and gravesite of the famous abolitionist John Brown, and then immediately donated it to the state of New York to serve as a historic site.
Oh, wow.
It always amazes me how many boards and commissions
Yeah.
people sat on in those days. And
Back in the day.
there was no technology. Weren't driving. Like, how did they manage
Yeah,
it?
their
all?
hands were in everything,
Yeah, so-
right?
But with a very, very strong interest in history and heritage and preservation, of course, which was also interesting here.
Right, right.
At that point. So for his estate in Burlington, Colonel Cannon engaged an architect who had just immigrated to the U.S. from Munich, Germany, and his name was William Rudolph Otto Burckholz. And Burckholz designed this impressive mansion in the French chateau-esque style that we can see here. And if we look carefully, we can see it has a three-story tower, mansard roofs, and a very large veranda down there on the right. Here's another view of the Overlake Mansion that shows its porte cochere on the right and the finely graveled driveway that connects to an intricate web of drives that went down through the estate grounds. Indeed, the Free Press, the Burlington Free Press noted in 1883 that everyone is familiar with the appearance of Overlake, Colonel Cannon's superb mansion at the foot of Prospect Street. We hardly know whether to class this place among the older or later styles of residence, as it essentially differs from both, and perhaps entitled to a class of its own. It is the unique residence of our city, and it is visited daily by scores of sight-seekers who are also generously accorded the privilege of driving through the spacious and handsome park which surrounds it. So here we have another view of that spacious and beautiful park, looking down one of the drives at Overlake.
Lovely.
The outbuildings.
Yeah, and we see on the left the tea house. He had an ornamental tea house there, and there was also a stone cottage on the grounds. In 1883, the Burlington Free Press noted about the grounds that for fineness of effect and excellence of design and care, we do not believe the ground and lawn of Overlake can be surpassed by any estate in New England. And here is a remarkable view, historic view, of the western edge of the Overlake Estate pine forest in ledges. And this is looking northeast, and what it shows kind of in the center is what appears to be a dovecote for raising pigeons just by the fence. And if you look carefully, you can see it has these Gothic windows with apparently missing panes where the birds could fly in, and then it has this big birdhouse up on the
Huge. That was so odd.
on the top.
The other building looks familiar.
Well, yes, because on the right we see a glimpse of the cupola of the carriage house behind the D.D. Howard House of the time, that's located at the corner of South Willow Street and Howard Street, which just happens to currently belong to our host, Ron
Oh my
Wanamaker.
gosh.
Oh, you
I'm going
outed
to have
him.
to put that crenellation back on that roof there, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is great.
So from this view, recent view, you can see in the distance some of the pine trees that are still standing
Yeah.
on the ridge of the old Overlake Estate. But instead of the dovecote, we see the Tudor Revival style home at 452
Yeah,
South
yep.
Willard, your next door neighbor there, that was built around 1927.
Right, yep.
So here is an 1881 survey plan of the Overlake Estate. And if we zoom in on it, we can see on the northeast corner of it, the location of the Overlake Mansion.
Okay, the house.
Okay,
Ridge
so it was
Prospect,
set
yeah.
back just a bit from South Prospect Street. This, again, for orientation, is opposite where the UVM Redstone campus is now, to the west of to the east of South Prospect Street, and it's also at the corner of Cliff Street. So then we see the Caretakers Cottage shown here, and the Carriage House that we'll talk more about, also on this 1881 plan.
That carriage house is still there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if we go down to the other edge of the plan, we can see one of these long carriageways that went all the way down to South Willard Street. And indeed, there was an entry gateway right next to what's currently your house.
Okay. Because
Down,
Barlow was the second owner of my house.
exactly,
I see,
right,
okay.
right at the corner, at the top of the corner of Howard Street.
Yep, yep. Neat.
So here's a view from around 1890. This is taken from the Redstone estate, looking west across towards the lake in the Adirondacks, but we can see the large pines there, and underneath the pines we can see some of the buildings. But it shows that the Overlake Mansion was well screened from
from the road, from the
the
public.
street. Here's an aerial view from 1939 that shows the Caretakers House and the Carriage House on the corner of Cliff Street
Yeah.
and South Prospect Street. So yeah,
It's one of my favorite buildings.
isn't it beautiful?
Love
I mean,
that
with the
house.
mansard roof,
Yeah.
this again dates from 1859. Burkholtz was the architect for this, as along with the main mansion, and it was converted into a residence in the late 1920s. And the architect in charge of that project was the Burlington-based architect Louis Newton.
Oh, okay. It was on our homes tour several years ago.
It's a beautiful
It's
property.
really neat. Yeah, it's the park.
And indeed, what's actually kind of fun about it is some of the buckthorns that are growing still around the corner can be traced back to the buckthorn hedge that was planted there during the Overlake Estate era. So next door to it is the Caretakers House. Again, built around 1859, also designed by the German architect Burkholtz, in this case in the Gothic Revival style. And we can see that wonderful trim on there, the barge
gingerbread almost. Yeah.
the cresting on the roof and the beautifully articulated chimneys and all of the nice stonework. It really is a gem. So in 1885, the Grand Canon gave as a wedding gift to his daughter Marion and her husband Louis Crawford Clark a magnificent 44-room shingle-style house that stood on the east side of the Overlake Estate at 545 South Prospect Street. Mr. and Mrs. Clark used this large home as a summer place for many years while Mr. Clark headed the prominent New York City banking firm Clark, Dodge & Company. Unfortunately, this large house that stood opposite the UVM Redstone campus was destroyed by a spectacular fire that happened on a Sunday afternoon in October 1976. According to the Free Press, arson was the probable cause of the blaze. The article went on to say the rambling frame house sheltered numerous prominent people, including Theodore Roosevelt for 2 nights before he became president, in the days when it was part of the well-kept summer estate. But it had become a white elephant by the 1960s and it was vacated for several years after housing 2 private schools for relatively brief periods.
Oh, it's such a shame.
There was a lot of arson activity in that
That
time
was a
period.
way to get
There
rid
really-
of buildings.
Yeah.
Well,
circling
there were so
down
many
the
buildings that were lost, unfortunately, during that period. You know, and again, I mean, we were talking last time. Similar thing happened to the Fern Hill Mansion. That also was presumed to be an arson issue. So then, kind of stepping back a bit, here we have a beautiful colored turn of the century view of one of the outbuildings on the Overlake Estate. By the mid-1880s, the Overlake Estate had become well known for the society events that were being held here by the Colonel's children, particularly his only son, Henry LeGrand Cannon, who was a bachelor artist in his 20s, better known in New York City society circles as Harry Cannon. Indeed, the Burlington Free Press noted in its society gossip column of August 12, 1886, there was a very enjoyable and elegant garden party on the grounds of Colonel LeGrand B. Cannon's Overlake Estate last evening. A number of young gentlemen and ladies from New York and Burlington were guests of Mr. Harry Cannon. Music was furnished by the Sherman Military Band, and choice refreshments were served in the rustic tea house on the grounds. Born in 1859, Harry was the youngest child of Colonel Cannon, and according to one biography, quote, deriving artistic interest and taste from his mother, he gave his early attention to various branches of art, and before he was 21 had produced many beautiful watercolors and had done much meritorious wood carving. From the first, his brush and chisel were means to gratify artistic desires and were never prostituted to the demands of commercialism. With ample fortune, necessity imposed no obligations. He was free to pursue his own sweet will in pursuit of the beautiful, and in its delineation had its inspiration in his poetic temperament. So in 1891, Harry Cannon married Miss Elizabeth Thompson of Detroit, and they had 3 children. 2 years later, it was reported that Mr. LeGrand B. Cannon and son arrived in the city Saturday morning on the early train. Mr. Harry Cannon came to look at the Crombie and Brown residences, which is Fern Hill, one of which he will probably lease for the summer. Neither quite suited him because there are not enough rooms for his 11 servants.
Whoa.
I hate when that happens.
Well, yeah, exactly. Nevertheless, despite this report, Harry Cannon did decide to rent Fern Hill, the estate on North Prospect Street that we discussed last time, as his summer place. In the following year, 1894, the Free Press noted that Mr. and Mrs. Harry LeGrand Cannon and servants, and Mrs. Brooks with Colonel Cannon's servants, arrived in the city from New York yesterday morning to remain during the summer. Mr. and Mrs. Cannon will again occupy Mr. Brown's residence, Fern Hill, on North Prospect Street, and Mrs. Brooks will reside with her father, Colonel Cannon, at his beautiful summer place, Overlake, on South Prospect Street.
And be neighbors.
Well, there's a bit of a stretch, but all part of the local Burlington society for the summer.
Burlington's own Downton Abbey.
Exactly.
Cool photo.
But within a year, tragedy struck when Harry Cannon died of a sudden illness. At the age of 38, in his New York home on May 6, 1895. One newspaper observed Mr. Cannon was a sculptor of more than ordinary ability. He was also a leader in New York society. For many years, Burlington has been his summer home, where he was expected with his family for the season today. The news of his death will come as a shock to many of his friends here.
Do any of his sculptures survive?
Or? Indeed they do. And not only that, but Burlington was well remembered in Harry Cannon's will. And he left to the University of Vermont Museum his extensive collection of, quote, East Indian curios and bric-a-brac, now in my father's residence in the city of Burlington, including the furniture, the carpets, the rugs, and hangings, end quote, on the condition that the University Museum would build a special room to house the collection, which they did. And this is the west wing of Torrey Hall that was built especially by the University of Vermont to house this collection from Harry Cannon. Currently, those objects in the collection are part of the UVM's Fleming Museum.
Okay. Oh, neat.
Harry Cannon.
We don't know what he died of?
It was
like-
described as a sudden illness, and there was something associated with his head or something on the head.
Oh,
It was all rather.
Injury or
It
growth
wasn't
or-
really something. It was rather vague, but again, it happened within a few days that he was expected, and then
Yeah,
it came as a
suddenly
shock.
died.
It
Yeah.
suddenly came as a shock.
Odd.
But Harry Cannon also bequeathed funds for the purchase of a set of chimes for Burlington's St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and he was associated with the church, as was his father. After these were installed, a piece was published in September of 1895 that noted the beautiful chimes that were rung out of the bells in St. Paul's Monday evening will continue to be rung, we hope, for many years, and will always serve to remind us of the young man who was cut down in his early years of manhood. Harry Cannon was sometimes criticized for his peculiarities, but in his legacy he has left a pleasant memory that will serve to obliterate all his faults and endear his name to us and all who may live after us. Unfortunately, St. Paul's was another building in
Right, that
Burlington that was
burned.
destroyed by fire, in this case in 1971, but the Harry Cannon chimes were rescued and they have been rehung to ring from the belfry of the modern Cathedral Church of St. Paul that was built in 1973 on the corner of Battery Street and Pearl Street that we
the
see
original
here.
Chimes are there.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a great piece of history.
So then on August 5th, 1897, at the invitation of Colonel LeGrand B. Cannon, the newly elected U.S. President William McKinley Jr. and Mrs. McKinley were invited for an afternoon breakfast at Overlake, along with U.S. Vice President Garrett Hobart, Vermont Senator Redfield Proctor, Vermont Governor Joshua Grout, and other dignitaries.
Wow.
In 1906, Colonel Cannon died at the age of 91 years, and the Overlake property was passed on to his daughter's husband, Lewis Crawford Clark, the successful banker that we discussed earlier from New York City, and Mr. and Mrs. Clark continued to use the Redstone Estate as their summer place. In 1923, the Overlake Estate was opened to the public for a grand pageant that celebrated Burlington's 150th anniversary. It was reported that as many as 15,000 people attended the grand event that was held on the grounds of the Overlake Estate.
Wow.
So, the Burlington Free Press reported that among the adornments of Overlake during this event, while graciously sharing hospitality, there were Colonel Cannon's three daughters, Mrs. Lewis Crawford Clark, Mrs. Horace Brooks, and Mrs. Chester Griswold, and various artistic features were displayed outside the home. These included the tea house, the studio, and so on. One can easily picture the patriotic and artistic influences of those golden days of Overlake coming down to the present and joining in the spirit in the historic pageants marking the 150th anniversary in Burlington's splendid development.
Oh, wow.
Quite an event. 15,000 people.
15,000 people, it was
Yes.
reported.
How much that must have
Wonder what the
cost
population
and
was at the
clean up
time. I
and-
mean,
yeah.
It's like the entire population, probably.
I think the family probably helped
Yeah.
out in many ways. But shortly thereafter, in 1924, Lewis Crawford Clark passed away. And the estate was inherited by his son, Julian B. Clark, who announced plans to have the large mansion, the Overlake Mansion, demolished and to subdivide the property into a residential subdivision. So the noted landscape architectural firm of the Olmsted Brothers of
Yeah.
Brookline, Massachusetts was engaged, and they came up with a plan to subdivide the property, and we can see here some of the advertisements that were included in the Burlington Free Press in 1925, advertising this new subdivision. And so throughout the summer, we can see they were talking about the residential lots that would be facing Willard Street, Cliff Street, and South Prospect Street. They invited tourists, summer visitors, and so on to campers to check out the choice lots near the 18-hole golf course, and invited others. Why not move here to Burlington? Why not live here? So shortly thereafter, a number of beautiful homes were constructed in what became known then as Overlake Park on the old grounds. So we have here just some of those beautiful, many of these were colonial revival style houses from the late 1920s into the early 1930s. Also along South Prospect Street, we see this 1926 colonial revival style home that was on the property. There were some Tudor revival style homes also built, but beautiful examples of 1920s and early 1930s architecture were built along the what is, of course, today referred to as Overlake Park, this subdivision. So the park extended down the hill all the way to South Willard Street along DeForest Road. And so here we're looking up from St. Willard Street. We can even see some of the newer buildings from the 1940s and 1950s that were built there. And even coming up DeForest Road, we even see some of the circa 1930s cast iron street lamps that are still there, that I certainly hope are preserved. We used to have many more of these 20 or 30 years ago, and this is one of the last that's remaining that really lends to the character.
Remind the city that these are worthwhile,
from that place.
Yep.
So anyway, with that, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk,
this is really
about Overlake Park.
Fun and exciting, and we've shared some of these pictures before, but you put them in a really great linear fashion where it's like you brought us right from the beginning of the wild lands, and then the beautiful mansion in the park and how it comes. I am always a little bit, I love finding out about this stuff and hearing about it, but then the sadness of, the demolishing of that magnificent building. But like you pointed out, the buildings, that wave of development, they're all beautiful in their own right now, just good, perfect example of architecture. So, thanks again, Tom, for bringing this stuff to us.
Most welcome. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
So a little foreshadowing for next time?
Well, yes, we have more grand estates to talk about that at least that I've been doing the research on. So we'll certainly look forward to the opportunity.
Terrific.
There are more stories to tell.
Great. Looking forward to it.
I have a question about his name. LeGrand is quite an interesting name.
Well, it is.
Do you know where that came from?
Yes. The family traces its roots to the French Huguenots who moved to the U.S. in the 1700s at a time when that group was being pushed, if you will, from France. And so, that is kind of the derivation of Canon, Legrand, or and so on. So I think there's been this strong connection to that heritage within the family.
Neat. That's really
Just a
neat.
really interesting name choice, big. Name a kid big.
Right, exactly.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks, Tom. Thanks everybody. CCTV Live at 525 Preservation Burlington. For more information on Burlington history, tours, events, you can always go to our website, preservationburlington.org, and you'll see us uploading dates and stuff as things become more firm. But definitely the annual awards are coming up. The Homes Tour is locked in.
And an opportunity to nominate somebody for an award.
And nominate awards.
So
yep.
help us out.
Yep. All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in.